Great, so let's recap this last section specifically. So we started with the legs. And remember the first one, I'll leave the pauses so you can think about it. Feel free to pause your video at home. The first one we looked at, remember the primary knee extensor was what group of muscles? The primary knee extensors. Remember we saw these on the front of the thigh. The primary knee extensors are going to be the quadricep group. Maybe you remember all four names. We've got on the medial side, vastus medialis. On the lateral side, vastus intermedius. And then right down the center, deep, we have vastus intermedius. And superficially down the middle, we have rectus femoris. Maybe you can remember the specific function of rectus femoris. Remember we talked about it as being slightly different than the quadriceps muscles. All four of them, remember, will extend the knee. Rectus femoris will also, remember, flex the hip. So rectus femoris will cross the hip joint here and take the leg up into hip flexion. Remember, we've got a couple other hip flexors working with it. Iliopsoas, TFL are the ones we talked about specifically. Now, maybe you can remember the antagonistic muscles to the quadriceps. So think about mirror image, back side of the body. Remember, we've got the hamstring group. And again, maybe you can remember the different muscle groups we have there. We've got two separate muscles, remember, on the medial portion, and one muscle with two bellies on the lateral portion. On the medial side, we have semimembranosus and tendinosus. And on the lateral side, we have biceps femoris. Remember, as a group, they're going to be powerful knee flexors and also assist with hip extension. Remember, primarily assisting gluteus maximus, our primary hip extensor. So we've got the quadriceps and the hamstrings, which remember are going to cover a majority of the musculature of the thigh. And then that little strip in the middle of the adductors that we mentioned as well. Then from there, we looked at the gastrocnemius. And we saw that the gastrocnemius was the one calf muscle that crosses the knee to assist. Do you remember the muscle that the gastrocnemius assists? Remember the hamstrings. Remember, they kind of cross over through the back of the knee. We've got the hamstring muscles crossing the back of the knee to insert on the fibula and the tibia, and the gastrocnemius crossing underneath the hamstring tendons to attach to the medial and lateral femur. So you could feel, remember we palpated the cables kind of crossing over there, making them a really strong combined force here to work through the back of the knee. So functions of gastrocnemius, we've got two, remember, because it's going to come all the way down onto the heel. We have one at the knee and one at the ankle to flex the knee. And remember the action at the ankle? Plantar flexion. So the only other thing we mentioned, remember, was the deeper muscles of the calf. And we talked about them really generally. And definitely there's a lot more complexity to this lower leg area. But we talked about them in a general sense as that deeper layer. We've got the soleus and the flexors of the calf, the deeper flexors that are all going to help with this plantar flexion. And some of them, remember, connecting to the toes and helping to curl the toes here. And then the muscles on the front side, the extensors, flexing or dorsiflexing the foot and the toes as well. So that's the lower leg. That's the recap. Again, a lot of that's pretty familiar to us, but we talked about some common tendencies and common points with the rectus femoris, the crossover of the hamstrings and the gastroc, and the basics of the lower leg muscles. Then we looked at the arm. So we added on, again, some of these layers that are a little bit more familiar to us. Maybe you remember some of the muscles that extend the shoulder. We talked about a few of them, actually, in this section to extend the shoulder. We talked about this broad muscle on the back here, the latissimus dorsi. We talked about the posterior delt. And we talked about the long head of the tricep, all contributing to that extension of the shoulder. Maybe you remember the antagonist as well. flexing the shoulder, we had this big broad muscle of the chest, the pecs, the front of the deltoid, and the long head of the bicep. So we have this kind of mirror image, front and back of the deltoid, the pecs and the lats, and the bicep and the tricep, creating this coordinated movement here of flexion and extension. Remember, we also talked about trapezius, and we talked about the obstacles of trapezius being that this upper part of trapezius folds over on itself, making it a much stronger muscle in general, which is important holding the shoulder up relative to gravity. But we said that our tendency will be to be weaker in the lower traps, and that the middle traps are going to function a lot like the rhomboids. So when we look at the trapezius, maybe you remember the last movement that we talked about. So we talked about the upper traps as an elevator, which is the action that's usually familiar to us. But maybe you remember the other action that we talked about of the upper traps. Remember, the other action of the upper traps was to upwardly rotate the scapula to allow us to lift the arm all the way up overhead. So that upward rotation allows us to lift the arm. Remember the function of the lower traps? To depress the scapula. Now, we looked at the deltoid a little bit already, but we left out the lateral deltoid. Remember the function of the lateral delts here? To abduct. And maybe you even remember back to our other abductor, the supraspinatus. Then we also mentioned, we talked about the pecs being a large muscle group as well, similar to the trapezius and the lats and a lot of these muscles we're looking at in this last section, that the pecs, because it is so large, has several different actions. Maybe you can remember some of the actions here. All right, we've got flexion, adduction, and internal rotation. So because of that, we also see this capacity to stretch the pecs in many different orientations. In extension, taking the arms behind us, maybe binding. Abduction, taking the arms out to the sides. As well as taking the arms up overhead, stretching this lower portion. Then we also talked about Pec Minor. Maybe you remember the main action of Pec Minor. Remember, it's just going to lie right here. So its movement capacity is very small. Its main function was to stabilize the front of the shoulder. So the important point on this one was that we were looking at working with that, not necessarily by stretching so much as working with it in postural scenarios, maybe in restorative poses or just in how we posture ourselves throughout the day. So we looked at the lats as this massive muscle on the back, a really important coordinator between the upper arm and the lower body, the pelvis. We looked at the trapezius, we looked at the pecs, we looked at the deltoid, and then we looked at the bicep and the tricep, which were pretty familiar to us. The main things we pointed out, remember, the main obstacle, we had one on each. The main obstacle with the biceps, remember, was this flossing through the bicipital groove and the attachment to the labrum. The main obstacle we looked at with the tricep was this tangling of the tricep with the lats and the infraspinatus. So we've got the tricep coming here, infraspinatus here, and then the lats coming here. So lats wrapping through here, and how they all overlap and potentially become a little resistant. Then the last thing we looked at briefly was the flexors and extensors. Flexors, remember, on this thin skin side, curling the fingers and the wrist, and the extensors on this thicker skin side, extending the fingers and the wrists. And again, a lot of those are more familiar, right? We've got, what do we have here? Quads, here, hamstrings, here, adductors. In general on this side, extensors, superficial on this side, gastrocnemius. Deep on this side, we have soleus and then flexors. We know this one, trapezius, deltoid, pec major, Pec Minor. It's a big sheet here, and we palpate it here, the lats. Then we know this one, bicep, tricep, flexors, and extensors. So these are a little bit more familiar to us. Hopefully we pointed out some of the obstacles and some helpful points to help paint a picture of the musculature of the arms and the legs.